Welcome to the webinar dealing with the recovery and opportunities for the senior housing operators. My name is Salima Shivji, and I'm the co-lead of our National Seniors Housing Initiative, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is a second part of our series on COVID-19 and its effect on the senior housing industry. As a quick reminder, the first webinar in this series focused on topics including regulation, public inquiries and commissions, class actions, and labor issues. The information provided in this webinar continues to remain relevant and can be found on the Dentons Canada COVID-19 Hub. I'll be introducing our speakers as we go through the webinar. We'll be hearing from 4 of our internal experts on the following areas: banking and finance, construction, opportunities for growth and recovery from a transactional perspective, and digital transformation. As we know, throughout the coronavirus pandemic, Canada's seniors population has been particularly vulnerable to the virus, and the media spotlight on this and all of seniors care facilities across Canada has been very, very lucrative. Given the number of seniors affected by the virus, various ministers and regulatory officials have issued a number of changes and guidelines to be followed by various operators. A number of providers continue to update their policies, implementation, and preparedness plans if they were to have a COVID case at one of their facilities. Although for-profit and private sectors have been more generally scrutinized, what has been found by the National Institute on Aging is that the age and configuration of the buildings has more of an impact on the risk of infection than does the operator type. Over the next 20 years, the 75 plus segment is expected to grow by almost 4% per year, and it'll account for 13.5% of the total population by 2040. As such, in order to maintain the current levels of senior housing inventory per capita, the total supply will need to more than double in the next 20 years to maintain the equilibrium. Despite some of the current challenges faced by operators in the short term, it appears that valuators and lenders are still confident about the senior housing area being a positive and a stable asset class. Given this, I would like to introduce Gary Rose, a partner in our financial service and banking group. Gary has extensive experience in transactional and routinely advises lenders from pre-term sheet stage through to due diligence, negotiation, drafting, and completion for lenders, specifically focused on the senior housing industry. Gary.
Thank you. Thank you, Salima. As Salima mentioned, I practice in the area of finance and lending, and a rather large portion of our portfolio at Dentons is in connection with long-term care facilities and financing of them. We act for lenders and borrowers in this regard. In looking at long-term care facilities and financing in particular, I wanted to focus on a few things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the basic structure of a credit agreement, then move from there relatively quickly to those provisions in a credit agreement that are long-term care facility specific, moving from there to the relatively recent effects that the pandemic has had on financings in general, and some of those covenants and other provisions in credit agreements in particular. From there, we'll talk a little bit about government intervention. There have been ministerial orders issued which have affected both owners and operators of long-term care facilities, as well as the lenders. And then finally, I'm going to look at a few examples of covenants that have been introduced during the pandemic to address areas of concern, followed by just touching a little on what we might see in the future with respect to financings. So in terms of the credit facility itself, okay, so when we look at credit agreements, from a lawyer's perspective, as a lawyer is drafting them, that lawyer is going to be looking very carefully at each provision, as will the lender in question. The borrower, of course, will look at those, but there are certain highlights. As a lawyer, for example, you'll focus particularly on security provisions and conditions precedent, because you'll be thinking about what is it going to take to get this loan funded. But you'll be looking at the other provisions. And as you walk through them, it should be an area of focus for the borrowers and the lenders with respect to representations and warranties. Those are things that talk about what is the state of affairs of the facility, what is the state of affairs of the borrower. It's saying this is how it looks right now. And nobody knows that really better than the borrower. Then there will be covenants, and covenants cover things such as what is permitted, what the borrower will do, what the borrower will not do, and including in those covenants are financial ratios and reporting, provision of financial statements, those kinds of things. Following that, events of default. Events of default typically are breaches of covenants or representations and warranties that prove not to be true at some point in the future. The next section would be remedies on default. So if there's an event of default, then what happens? And then finally, the miscellaneous provisions, which are fairly generic in nature, governing law, what jurisdiction is applicable to the credit agreement, etc. So moving on from there, some of these provisions that are specific to long-term care facilities, and there'll be a continuing theme here, and there's no real magic to them, but they focus on material contracts, such as master service agreements and multi-party agreements with the health authority. And each jurisdiction, each province has its health authority, and sometimes more than one that they will deal with. The funding conditions, again, go back to these agreements, these specific agreements that have to be in place and understood and binding to the extent they can be binding if you're dealing with a facility, a long-term care facility and construction. And then representations and warranty, the same thing. It's referring generally back to the relationship between the borrower and the health authority and the contracts that are in place between them. Again, covenants, the same kind of thing, referring back to these same agreements and events of default, often in terms of long-term care facility, specific events of default, again, referring back to these governing contracts. So moving on to their pandemic-related issues, there have been of late several ministerial orders that have been issued. And these ministerial orders have been issued in response to a perceived lack of control or lack of standards or not adhering to standards with respect to long-term care facilities. And those result in things like the suspension of the master services agreement, which is the agreement under which the facility is operated. What can happen here is the health authority can take control over the facility or appoint a third party to take control. They can actually settle, renegotiate, or extend the agreements that are in respect of the indebtedness, i.e. the credit agreement, which of course can be disconcerting to a lender. They can then collect rents and profits in respect of the facility. And these, of course, a portion of these rents and profits would be used to pay the loan that had been advanced. So obviously this is of concern to a lender and to a borrower because it's of concern to a lender. So what has been the reaction to this? There have been new covenants introduced. There's generally a tightening of covenants. There's more attention being paid to these long-term care facility covenants. In addition to that, new covenants have been introduced. I'm just showing you an example of a few. Covenants related to the contingency and response plans dealing with the pandemic and influenza outbreaks, and also personal protective equipment supplies. These hitherto hadn't typically been baked into a credit agreement. Now they are, and it's obvious why. We see concerns about, for example, personal protective equipment. We see that all over the news. It was a hot topic for a period of time. So obviously the lenders are concerned about that. There are also covenants related to the appointment of a monitor during an outbreak, such as a pandemic. often it's not at all unusual to see a provision for the appointment of a monitor if the financial situation deteriorates, but now we're talking about something in addition to that, and that's what's happened in respect of the pandemic. And then you see also the more robust communication rights between the lender and the health authority. You'll see that in letters on at the outset of a relationship. The lender wants to make sure that it can go around the borrower and talk directly to a health authority. And that communication isn't typically private. It's a three-way communication amongst, say, the borrower, the lender, and the health authority. And these kinds of things obviously are very much common sense, but when times get more difficult, a lot of these things that are addressed in a generic way, in a general way in a credit agreement, are focused on far more specifically. So the future of long-term care facility financing, you know, as I believe Salima mentioned, this is not going away. What will probably happen is, because of the aging demographic, there will be more of these long-term care facilities constructed, so there will be more of a need for financing. And the health authorities and the minister, the governments know that. And so they are motivated to work with providers and also lenders in respect of the construction of new facilities. And also, because standards are being tightened up, there will be renovations required of existing facilities. And then again, that leads to more opportunities for financing and more opportunities for the borrowers, the operators, to upgrade their facilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. So now we'll turn to the topic of construction. There were a number of large transactions that occurred last year, which involved properties that were under construction to be completed at the end of 2020 or Q1 of 2021. Pursuant to such agreements, the seller was responsible for the development costs and completion, and the purchasers acquired assets upon completion of construction. Here to speak to us about some of the complexities, nuances, and opportunities around construction, I'd like to introduce you to Jana Mansour. Jana is the National Co-Chair of Dentons Canada's Infrastructure and PPP Group. Jana advises investors, developers, and contractors from early stage consideration through financing, construction, operation, and disposition of large-scale projects. Jana.
Thank you, Salima. So when I was first asked to comment on construction in the context of COVID-19 and the development of large long-term care facilities, it occurred to me that the construction phase itself would not differ particularly for long-term care facility as compared to vertical buildings or other infrastructure that might be needed in the wake of the COVID-19. What would likely be involved here is the redesign of these facilities to address some of the problems we've observed in jurisdictions like Quebec and Ontario due to the number of residents in the same room, the sharing of facilities like bathrooms, etc. And so that design phase will need to be carefully considered so that when we move to the construction phase, we know that the product to come out of it will be the one that's needed for the long term. And what I wanted to then, therefore, is to spend a little time talking about where we are today in the construction industry because of COVID-19, and then spend a little time talking about how we might adjust construction contracts with a view to addressing what are likely to be continuing effects of the pandemic, and perhaps even get ready for different pandemics in the future. So, starting perhaps with COVID-19 and the construction industry in general, what have we learned so far? Well, when the virus first exploded onto the scene, there was a quick reaction to look at contracts to see specifically what they said about force majeure and acts of God and other instances beyond the reasonable control of the party as a grounds for seeking relief for the likely impacts. What happened, however, is that most of these impacts were not driven by the virus itself, but rather by the reaction we observed from governments, namely through provincial health officers and other arms of the government that acted quickly to contain the virus and prevent transmission and protect the public in general, including construction workers. And so that took different forms. For example, in Ontario and Quebec, we're all aware there was a complete shutdown of the construction industry for a significant amount of time. These areas are just reopening, and the transition will be clearly a challenge, and adjustments will be needed. In British Columbia, for example, where I am, the construction industry was not shut down. We did receive orders from up above saying social distancing was a requirement at construction sites. There was also a limitation on gatherings in excess of 50 people. And of course, work safety organizations that are active in all provinces took action to implement regulations around PPE and other measures to protect construction workers. So all these decisions essentially resulted in a change of the regulatory environment in which contractors had to operate, which triggered essentially claims under the change in law provisions of the contract. And that's an important distinction because in most contracts, a force majeure claim will entitle the contractor to an extension of time, but no reimbursement for extra costs, whereas a change in law claim will typically entitle the contractor to both money and time. And so it's in that context that I wanted us to now consider new contracts. So next slide, please. So as we start putting in place new contracts for all sorts of activity, it's important to first acknowledge the reality of COVID-19. The virus is still among us, and while we're hopefully through the first wave, there's still talk of a second wave, and what that might look like, no one really knows. And what's important, therefore, in the contract is for both the owner and the contractor to explicitly acknowledge in writing that they're entering into a contract at a time when COVID-19 is out there, and make a clear point about the fact that there are effects that are currently ongoing, and that those effects will not be deemed bases for claims under the contract the moment right after you sign. Of course, you don't want to sign a contract into a claim situation, so creating that baseline will be important. And what that means ultimately is that only effects of the pandemic that occur after the contract is signed, and those effects are not easily predictable by each party, would be grounds for a claim. That brings me to the definition of force majeure. You will want to pay attention to how that definition is worded. We've encountered contracts where, unfortunately, that definition was poorly worded, was limited in the sense that it was drafted as an exclusive list of events. And oftentimes, in looking at those clauses, the words epidemic or pandemic were missing, which created some headaches when they could have been avoided. Most often, however, these clauses are drafted generally by reference to a concept, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of a cause that is beyond the reasonable control of the party. And it's going to be important to decide up front whether you want COVID, including its future ramifications, to fall within or outside the definition of force majeure to the extent you have a specific regime provided for in your contract. Regardless of whether or not you adjust the definition of force majeure, you're going to want to pay attention to the obligation to mitigate. That obligation is most often expressed explicitly in the contract. When it's not, there's often argument around the fact that it's implicit to the relationship the parties entered into. And regardless of how you deal with it, you may want to tweak that a little bit to address COVID-19. And what that looks like could be specific measures that the contractor will be expected to put in place in advance of a future outbreak, whether it's keeping sufficient PPE at site or dividing the work stream so that you can displace some activities, putting, for example, the development of some modules or various pieces of equipment at another site, so that if your main site is affected by COVID-19, at least some of the work can continue at other locations, and this way get around the potential risks that are involved, especially if a future outbreak is very localized and you can try to avoid impacting your entire project. As part of anticipating future disruptions, it's also important to make clear that the contract is entered into during COVID-19 and that future events derived from that pandemic should not be a source of argument for frustration of purpose or impossibility of performance with respect to the contract. We want to set aside these grounds and make clear that the parties entered into the contract with both eyes open, and we're not going to try to use COVID-19 as a way to defeat the contract. That said, there may be reasons to terminate the contract that are totally legitimate, whether because a future outbreak lasts for an amount of time that is really beyond anyone's willingness to stay in the contract, either because the standby costs are such that there's really too much of a cost to stay in the contract, or because the project becomes less relevant as time goes by. And so there are often in contracts this notion of an extended force majeure termination, which allows a party to terminate if force majeure impacts substantially all of the work for a period that is usually set as being sufficiently long that would be the right time to cut off. Whether that's 90 days, 120 days, 180 days, you might want to provide for more or less time, depending on whether you also have a distinct right for COVID, in which case you might provide for more time. And the way to negotiate these waiting times might involve the owner pitching in some money to keep the contractor on standby, as opposed to just the contractor walking away and leaving the owner hanging. Another element to consider is the situation where your particular contractor is impacted, but the market as a whole is still able to perform the work, and that could happen, for example, if that contractor's key personnel or most of its staff has been impacted by the virus such that they're either in quarantine or otherwise unable to perform the work, in which case the owner might want to provide for a special right allowing it to terminate that particular contractor and hire a new general contractor, and then requiring the terminated contractor to assign or novate subcontracts, either all of them or those most critical to the continuation of the project, to the new general contractor, so that that new general contractor may continue the work with minimum disruption. Next slide, please. So in order to illustrate some of the points I just talked about, I wanted to quickly run through some of the clauses from the CCDC2 template contract that is very often used in situations such as this one. It's a stipulated price contract, and I have here GC 652, which is the instance where a public authority or a court suspends the work, and the contractor is entitled to both a time extension and reimbursement for reasonable costs. That clause is often looked at in tandem with the next slide, please, which is GC 722, which is that right I alluded to earlier. In this case, it's limited to a suspension ordered by a court or a public authority, and it refers to a period of 20 working days. And in that case, the contractor has the right to terminate the contract. You will want to look at that clause carefully to consider whether it should apply at all to a COVID situation, or if it should apply to COVID, whether you would want to extend that 20 working days, because we might anticipate future lockdowns to last much longer than that. And you wouldn't want to be in a situation where the contractor can simply terminate and walk away from the project in that case. Next slide, please. Looking at 653, this is what I refer to as the force majeure clause of the CCDC2. I highlighted paragraph 4, which is a cause beyond the reasonable control of the contractor. And as you can see, it allows for extension of time, but no payment for costs. You will want to decide, as you consider this clause, whether COVID should even be included in that section, or whether it should be considered completely outside this section and have its own treatment. And even if it was considered a force majeure, you might consider that COVID is such that it's unfair for the contractor to bear all the costs, and there could be a regime that is negotiated to allow the contractor to feel it's worthwhile bargain to stay in the contract despite a new outbreak of COVID. Next clause, please. Next slide, please. 1027 is the change in law clause. As I mentioned, this allows a claim for extra money, and it refers to GC 6.6, which I allude to in the next slide, please. And as we can see, it talks about mitigation, and it also talks about the importance of keeping records so that the contractor can substantiate the claim that it has for extra costs. And so that's a quick overview of things to consider. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jana. So governments and regulatory authorities have made a number of changes, including new infection protocols, design changes, amendments to regulatory standards, as well as new ways of monitoring and engaging with staff, residents, and families. So this is likely to lead to a lot of obsolete senior housing inventory, but also ideas being replaced. It'll require operators to be more innovative and harness new opportunities to handle the new reality. As we move from the crisis phase of the pandemic to the recovery and opportunities phase, I'd like to introduce Nicole Baklamasi, who will be speaking to us about opportunities for growth and recovery from a transactional perspective. Nicole is a partner in the Denton Security and Corporate Finance Group with a focus on corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, stock exchange listings, and other regulatory compliance matters. Her and I work closely on a various number of transactions to negotiate and administer approvals and consents from healthcare regulatories in this sector. Nicole.
Thanks, Salima. So yeah, as Salima indicated, it's going to be a new world for operators post-COVID-19, and I'm going to try to briefly touch on some of the opportunities that I think are going to come to the forefront. First of all, we are going to see that operators that have experienced minimal COVID disruption and who've been able to show regulators they have policies in place to ensure that they may become asked by a health authority to take over a management of another facility. My colleague Gary Rose mentioned this earlier in the presentation. And this is when the health authority often revokes the service agreement with an operator. We've seen examples of this in the province and in other provinces in Canada. The regulators will know which operators have the lowest incidence rates and which operators have the policies that they want to put in place in new sites. But not only being pushed into this or asked to be put into this role by the regulator, it may be a service that you could offer up to other operators in the space who have not yet had their management service agreement revoked or may not have it, but are having staffing and supply issues due to the pandemic and need assistance with one or more of their properties in their portfolio to allow them to concentrate their efforts on others. When you get one of these agreements or one of these opportunities, you want to be really comfortable with the terms, both length and all the terms of the agreement. And the regulator may have a large amount of influence in this case. You want to be ensured that the management contracts afford sufficient control to the manager to effectively manage the facility and deal with any future outbreak, but also standard indemnifications and protections. There are also benefits that could come, not only just the addition of management fee income. There are new economies of scales that can be reached with operators who are taking over third-party facilities. You can increase your purchasing power specifically for PPE, and also often homes have unallocated staff hours that they could put to these third-party facilities. I think we're going to see the homes that have less COVID incidences become targets for outside investment and acquisitions for investment portfolios. And these are typically in joint venture structures or full outright purchase for a publicly traded REIT or some other kind of private real estate investment trust group. When negotiating these, you want to make sure that you know all the terms that are being looked into, especially for the joint venture, because this is a partnership that's going to continue into the future. Typically, a large fund brings in investment capital to take a management position and a material position of the ownership, leaving the original owner with a small percentage, but the management of the facilities. You need to ensure that you are happy to work with this partner going forward, and that you're comfortable with all the terms they have. You need to make sure that you are you're on side with what they're looking for non-competes and rights of first refusal, so it doesn't interrupt perhaps some of your go forward plans, because oftentimes they'll invest in only some of your sites, not all of them, or half your portfolio, not the other half, and you want to be able to manage your other portfolios. You may also be poised to increase your foothold in the space. We think that operators with older facilities are going to be harder hit, and they're going to be looking to offset these buildings. And oftentimes we're going to see a reduction, I think, in the cost of these buildings and the value of these buildings. Number of beds per facility is going to become way less the benchmark for value, and we're going to see something closer to number of single occupancy rooms and other spaces, bathrooms, kitchens, social spaces per facilities as a more value indicator. And the older multi-bed rooms are going to be repurposed. And oftentimes there's ability to negotiate in the sale contract quite a reduced price because there is a redesign required. Also, people could use the older facilities for different structures, staff buildings, et cetera, that are not purely seniors housing. But as Salima mentioned earlier, this is still a very strong asset class. It is stable and it is poised for growth. And even in the slowdown, we have seen increase in the number of residents, and the people moving into these facilities is still on the uptick. And there will be interest from lenders and funders and investors into this space. Next slide. And I also think that the pandemic has given owners a true test of their facilities and a better understanding of what practices are beneficial in the face of a pandemic, and can use this information to move forward towards recovering the space and recover not just managerial, but the public's impression of the space. It's a good time to take opportunity to review and revise your policy manuals, not in just to reference the new regulations coming out and the new requirements of your lenders, but just to ensure that you have the best practices in place and that you really support your staff and your residents. You're going to want to consider your staffing ratios, your room assignments, your resident schedules. You want to ensure that you have good documentation and storing. You want to make sure that the records are easily available and easily shared to ensure that your compliance efforts are clear and you can prove this to a regulator at any time. You may want to consider at this point revising your document retention policies. You want to keep an open and clear line of communication with your banks and your regulators and all your financing partners, and having a good sense of documents will help you with that. But these practices will also help with the transactional considerations should an operator be looking to exit or to exit a few packages or assets. Operators can expect the banks and all financing partners are going to start to ask for pandemic response data and policies as part of their due diligence. Gary discussed that lenders will be looking at response plans and PPE supplies. Potential investors and buyers are going to be looking at the same thing, and it's best to ensure your best practices are set now before any due diligence is complete and you're not behind the 8 ball. As we all have discussed on this call, the older style homes are going to become less valued, and we're going to be looking for different types of housing that are perhaps less at risk for pandemic failings. As I mentioned, moving them into staff housing, university housing, pain and rehab recovery facilities, or other items in your portfolio as opposed to elderly full-time care homes. And certain lenders and financing partners may be requiring this of the operators going forward. You want to look into what type of bulk buying you can do, especially for PPE. And I think it's important at this point to look for disruptive technologies that can assist in coming up with ways to improve pandemic response. I've heard of, temperature monitoring cameras that can advise of abnormalities during nursing off hours. And I believe there's probably lots more technology out there, and it would be a good time to start investing in disruptive technologies that could avoid this type of pandemic in the future. And it's just a quick touch on the transactions and kind of getting poised for transactions. Each type of transaction is very different and has its own considerations. So I didn't go into each one specifically, but perhaps that'll be phase 3 of this webinar.
Thanks, Nicole. And the technologies is a good segue into our next speaker here. As the evolving landscape for senior housing has inevitably required for new technologies, privacy measures will also be required to ensure that the residents, staff, and families have their personal information kept safe and secure. Here to talk to us today about the potential opportunities in digital transformation and some of the forecasted trends in technology, as well as data security, is Kristen Thompson. Kristen is a partner and national lead of the Transformation Technology and Data Strategy Group. She has a particular concentration in data-driven industries and disruptive technologies. Please take it away, Kristen.
Thanks, Salima. Hello, everyone. As Salima mentioned, this is my practice area, anything to do with digital transformation. Let's go to the first slide. What we're going to do is a quick survey of the technologies that we are seeing in this space. And what's happened with COVID is that a lot of things that were being considered, or at least thought about, were suddenly critical to the survival and safety of many of these types of facilities. So the transformation, instead of happening over a series of years, happened over, in some cases, a series of weeks. And I'm going to address some of the risks and opportunities a little later. But first, we're going to do a high-level tour of some of these technologies and how they impact really the core business model and the service delivery of these facilities. So the first one that we're seeing is a move towards person-centric design. Now, this might seem obvious until you think way back, if you were of a sufficient age, of those personal safety devices. They were clunky, they were clearly safety, they were all beige, they weren't particularly interesting. What's happening is these sorts of things are evolving to become far less obvious and interfere with daily living. So we see smart jewelry. These are things that are worn, that nobody knows, that older adults can wear without feeling self-conscious. Similarly, we have non-wearable health trackers. All of these things monitor health and well-being, either in their home or in a care facility. These are, at their core, they're really Internet of Things connected devices. And many of you who aren't in a care facility but are at home probably have some of these things right now, like a Fitbit and similar sorts of devices. With these devices comes a whole different type of information that is being collected and may well be accessed by the facility itself, or perhaps controlled or accessed by third parties. Next slide, please. Along with these sort of less clunky wearables and interface, we're starting to see the user interfaces are disappearing. So it's no longer clicks or switches. What we're seeing is things that sort of vanish into the background and we take for granted. Anybody who's talked with a 10 or 11-year-old will understand that they just take certain things for granted. And I don't know how many of you have, with failing eyes like my own, have looked at magazines, been quite unable to focus on it, and then tried to make the screen bigger by doing the two-finger touch. Yeah, it doesn't work. But that's a generation that has grown up with these sorts of things, and it's an expectation about how things should work. Of course, as people age, some of these are actually enabling technologies. You lose dexterity, it's difficult to see things. Mice are always a problem, touchpads even more so. But if you can use your voice, that might be something that's a benefit to individuals. We also see gesture-based solutions, so pointing with your hand or waving. If you want to go way back for about 20 or 30 years, some of you will remember the clap on, clap off. That is a gesture-based solution. It's old and nifty, but it's the same sort of thing. We also see smart clothing evolving. So these are passive monitoring devices. There are sensors that passively monitor vital signs in like something like a t-shirt or other less obtrusive. So there's no user interface. These things are just out there. Next slide, please. We're starting to also see a greater recognition of the social determinants of health. And this is sort of a nebulous, fuzzy area, but what it really means is that depending where you are on the income and economic advantage spectrum, you will have better or worse outcomes in health. Some of those social determinants aren't just where you sit in the economic strata, but also where you sit in terms of your social integration. So one of the things we're seeing is the ability or the desire of companies to start increasing the ability of individuals to control more things in their life. A good example is the ability to have on-demand ride programs. Food delivery and socialization, there's a program out of Johns Hopkins, which is very interesting. These sorts of things also require partnerships with third parties. So once again, we have typically participants in completely different sectors that are now partnering with those in the long-term care area. Next slide, please. Concierge or tech-enabled concierge service is another example of that person-centric solutions. So what this is essentially, if you think of your iPhone or whatever type of phone that you have a concierge in front of you. So you have this one central thing that has a whole bunch of apps that do things for you. A concierge is very similar. There's a number of platforms that have a number of these on-demand services. So if you are in a particular facility, you can have an access to these concierge. You can order various types of things through apps, through that facilitate contact with service providers. This requires various types of agreements in the background between the service providers, usually a large constellation of them, because the more apps you have, the more desirable you are, and the facility itself. There's a significant advantage here for many facilities because the ability of older adults to use a concierge service to service themselves decreases their reliance on family caregivers to run errands and on nursing staff or other staff in the facility. Next slide. Robots. Who doesn't like robots? Robots are no longer a thing of science fiction. They are still early stage. The building that I'm in right now has a very primitive robot. It doesn't lead fitness classes, but it does in the morning roll down the hallways cleaning the floors. It's entirely automatic. It's a little alarming when you first run across it when you round a corner, but after a while you get used to it. And studies show that people adapt very quickly to robot healthcare providers, fitness providers, that sort of thing. We're seeing more and more involvement of robots. Some of them look like robots, some of them look less like robots. There are a wide variety of robots or automation efforts. Some of them are what you see here. They lead health classes, they provide an emotional connection, they've got a chat sort of function that they can interact, and having used a number of these things, they're actually quite remarkable. There's others that are more focused on efficiency, and what we are going to see is a lot of automation in the back of the house, so laundry, meal prep, that kind of thing. We've already seen it in the hospitality industry and in the hospital sector. We're starting to see an uptake in the long-term care sector. But once again, you've now got third-party vendors in there. It's very few long-term care facility owners that are going to have their own robot division. Sort of hand in hand with the robots comes artificial intelligence to augment caregiving. And this is something that really took off at COVID, particularly in the telemedicine space, largely because people weren't allowed to leave their homes or wherever they were, and they still had to access some kind of health information. Telemedicine was an obvious solution. Governments and regulators and the health colleges all pivoted very quickly to facilitate this kind of thing. So there was a rapid change in the regulatory framework here. Same sort of thing in the long-term care sector. We see artificial intelligence solutions. They can deliver a phone call, they can check on medications, they can track sorts of things and predict problematic outcomes. There's a fall prediction software that is having some success based on simply viewing a person's gait repeatedly. Avatars, one of my favorites is Socks the cat. It's a virtual cat that requires you to take care of it and interact with it, and it feeds information back to the AI interface, and it alerts caregivers, human caregivers, if there's a change in mood or a change in cadence of speech, that kind of thing. Next slide. Along with this, if you're using artificial intelligence or many of these technologies, you require data. So what we're seeing is data sharing and collaboration amongst a number of organizations. A good example is a partnership you see between a transportation company and a long-term care company. Again, completely different sectors, but coming together to provide a service. When companies do this, they have to be aware of the different expectations from the different sectors. While the ride-sharing platform may be very, very good at ride-sharing, it's not necessarily very good at protecting personal health information, for instance. Next slide. And just to conclude our tour, the other piece of this is not just what happens in the facility, but it's also we're seeing increased recognition and support for family caregivers. This is the aging in place model. So employers particularly are signing up for all sorts of programs that support elder care. And you often see, they're almost like the telemedicine apps or other sorts of delivery mechanisms that either have specifically targeted content or they support communities. And there's a lot of development in that. And the idea here is that the family caregivers, to take the burden off of them, allows better outcomes in health. Next slide. So why did all of this matter? Why did I just spend 8 slides talking about this? It's not business as usual. Long-term care providers are very, very good at running buildings and providing health care and the associated care that goes around that. They're not necessarily very good at these new business models. There are new risks that are involved with some of these business models and technologies, and many of them are completely new or may not even be anticipated by the providers. So this business model, the question you need to ask yourself if you're using these technologies or using them as part of a larger business model, it's, do you have a coordinated approach to these sorts of things? That's called a data strategy. And that's one of the things I do is I help companies with their data strategy. Where are you now and how do you want to get there? It looks at aligning the data management practices with not only regulatory requirements, but the strategic goals of the organization. Another key component of these new business models is they typically require the long-term care providers to rely on new types of vendors or partner arrangements. Very few provide their own in-house services. They're almost always with third parties. So you need to ask yourself what your arrangements are there. First question is obviously, do you have a written agreement with each of these new vendors or partners? And what does that agreement look like? Do you have a consistent risk approach? Do you know what your risk tolerance is? Do you monitor it? Has it changed recently? The usual valves of limitation of liability and indemnification. Do these make sense given what technology you're acquiring? What are your data protection provisions? You may not have needed data protection provisions up until now, and now suddenly you've got third parties that have a whole bunch of data and are using a whole bunch of data that you may be providing or may be coming directly from the residents. And cybersecurity provisions. How robust is your cybersecurity, and what are you requiring of your vendors and partners? Next slide, please. On that point, with tech innovation, most of these technologies will require some kind of system access. That will generally increase the attack surfaces, which is a fancy way of saying you have more holes in your boat. Your increased volume and sensitivity of information, you now have personal information, which you probably had before. You've got personal health information, but now you may have payment card information and other types of information. The sheer volume and sensitivity of that information makes you a much more attractive target for malicious actors. And of course, you have a vulnerable population of users susceptible to phishing and all sorts of other social engineering attacks. The key to this is obviously, remember, you're only as strong as your weakest connected device. That requires you to do due diligence and make sure that you've got all those holes in the boat plugged. On that theme of new types of data and increased volume, so you have personal information. You now have a lot more personal information. So your regulatory scope is now not only federal and provincial privacy laws, but you've also got private and possibly public sector privacy laws. You've got personal health information that will trigger health privacy laws at the provincial level, but it may also trigger health regulatory obligations under the colleges and professional practice standards, for instance, around record keeping, file transfers, confidentiality, electronic records. An organization's representations about its data may also trigger the competition law risk around misleading representations that have been made with respect to the handling of data. And there was just recently a $9 million fine handed out by the Competition Bureau to a social media platform for materially misleading individuals about their privacy practices. These are the sorts of things that myself and my team assist with. I would encourage organizations that are adopting these technologies to do privacy impact assessments prior to adopting the technologies or implementing new processes. It serves as a red flag on any potential privacy issues and allows you to mitigate the risk. Ongoing privacy audits are also another service we provide to just make sure that things haven't deviated from the original scope. And then finally, there is a talent shortage on those people that know something about privacy are in high demand, and they're also very hard to find. Your current privacy officer, it's a requirement that you have a privacy officer, but your current privacy officer may not quite be up to the task of managing multiple projects, many of them probably COVID related and urgent timelines. There's also new data types that may be available. All these new relationships and perhaps some different regulatory context. If your privacy officer is not quite up to speed on these things or needs somebody in the background to provide some backstopping, one of the things we've offer now is a virtual privacy officer solution to help these projects stay on track and mitigate the privacy risks. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I must admit, I do have a Jibo in our house and we celebrated its 3rd birthday. So there you go. There's our robot already in. So with that, our hour has flown by, and I just wanted to recap some of the major insights and takeaways that we heard through from our various speakers here. So one is the sector is still viewed as a stable class asset for lenders and valuators. 2, there's lots of opportunities for growth and recovery in this sector. It is a wide sector, it's a growing sector. So there is lots of opportunities, both in terms of collaboration with within the sector, but also with partners from outside of the sector. And thirdly, there are a number of required technologies and exciting innovation that will continue to create opportunities in this sector. So the Denton Senior Housing Group is well situated and qualified to help you assist you and your team tackle upcoming challenges and opportunities. Should you ever want to leverage our insights further or want to get in touch with any one of us, we'd be more than happy to hear from you and put you in touch with the right member of our team. Thank you so much for listening in. There's also a great online resource at the dentonscanada.com Canada COVID Hub that can be found at our website. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.